Hello and welcome, Jim Crawley.
Hi,
How are you?
I'm good, thanks. Yeah.
Welcome everybody. This is Nigel Polak speaking. This is September 2024, and I'm speaking with Jim Crawley. I'm speaking as the current president of the Psychotherapy and Counselling Federation of Australia, PACFA, in 2024, and I'm speaking with the first inaugural president of PACFA, Jim Crawley, who was president of PACFA from 1999. First, before we begin, Jim, let's acknowledge country. We are in Australia, and we do have historical owners of the lands upon which we're each sitting. I'm sitting in the mid-north coast of New South Wales. I'm on Gumbaynggirr country, and I know that you're sitting in Perth. And so I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of these lands and pay our respects to their elders past and present, and to say hello to any Aboriginal people, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that are listening here with us today. Thanks so much for being here, Jim. We've got a range of topics to cover, sort of talking to you about how you came into PACFA, and then your experience of PACFA throughout. Would it be okay if we began with your sort of earlier life and career, and what your backstory is, even coming into the professions of counselling and psychotherapy?
Yep. Well, as people probably tell from my voice, I'm English. Grew up in a very ordinary middle-class English family, but as I came to realise, one that had been very profoundly affected by World War II. I was born just at the end of World War II in 1944. My mother's family her father was a very successful solicitor in London, and 5 children, but 2 of her brothers were killed within a week or 2 of each other in the war, and then her father died shortly after, quite prematurely. And my father served throughout the war in the British Army and saw a lot of action, which he would never talk about. And I guess today we'd say he was probably affected by, I don't know, PTSD or something. He was a very quiet, contained person. He just did his job, came home. That was it. The stories I get about him from before the war was a much more sociable, outgoing, lively person. So I think the whole family was sort of very clustered in together around sort of being protective and so on. I grew up in the south of England mostly, particularly Portsmouth. That was very formative for me. Those days very much the centre of the Royal Navy. And I was in the cadet corps at school, and the only possible career for me was to go into the Royal Navy. End of year 12, I actually took the form to go to the officer training school at Dartmouth to my form teacher, because he had to sign it, and he sort of looked at it and said, well, you'll do very well in the Navy, but are you sure you want to spend your life sitting on a ship hoping there won't be a war? Which was a different way of looking at it. And he said, why don't you go to university first and then go into the Navy? And I said, you can't do that. He said, oh, yes, you can. So that was the end of the Navy. Which at one level it was sad, but yeah, I'm quite sure I went a much better path in the end. Went to uni, or had a year off actually, because I hadn't planned to go to uni. So I worked in a factory and things like that, which was a very good experience. Went to uni, did a degree in sociology. Didn't get a very good degree because 2 of the 3 years I was at uni, I was on the executive of the student guild, and that was far more important than studying. Left uni and went to an Anglican theological college, intending then to become an Anglican minister, Anglican priest. I was a bit disillusioned with the quality of the pastoral care there, but I also had the opportunity that year to go with one of the staff members of the college to sit in on ward rounds at a new psychiatric unit that had just opened up in the General Hospital. And that fascinated me. At the end of my first year at college, it was suggested I, quote, go and do social work for a year to get it out of your system. And it took me 35 years to go back. I got a job as a trainee social worker in London, East End of London, Hackney Hospital. And after a few months was able to move into a new clinic they set up for heroin addicts. So a new system was being introduced for people struggling with heroin addiction. And that was a very enjoyable job. I really loved that job. It also pushed me into having to learn how to be with people and talk with them and so on. I had, my studies had virtually no training in counselling, but I learned on the job, as it were, and got some supervision. I then went off to the London School of Economics, did the graduate training in psychiatric social work, which was very psychoanalytic in its orientation in those days, and then worked in a child psychiatric clinic in the south of England for a couple of years before getting my first academic job teaching social work in London. While I was in that job in the psychiatric clinic, family therapy was just starting to appear on the horizon, and I was able to get in on some of the early workshops in England learning a bit about family therapy. I remember that I persuaded the consultant psychiatrist in charge of the clinic we should do some family therapy, so he and I arranged to see a new family as a family rather than splitting them up as we normally did. It's a family of two teenage boys who got into quite a violent fist fight during the interview, and we sort of sat there trying to be non-directive. Eventually they sat down again, and after the family had left, we both turned to each other and said simultaneously, "Why didn't you do something?" But we went on, started to explore the possibilities of family therapy. My teaching first teaching job in London, I taught group dynamics and social casework. I'd always been very interested in group work, and during that time when I was in London, I had 2 years in a twice-weekly psychoanalytic group, and had hoped to go on and become a group psychoanalyst, but I'd met and married an Australian, and we came to Australia instead. And I got another academic job in Melbourne, what was then called Preston Institute of Technology, later Phillip Institute of Technology, and now RMIT University. I was there for 10 years, and it was a very rewarding experience. It was a new institution. I arrived when the Bachelor of Social Work degree was in its second year. Because it was a new institution, we had a very free hand in developing the curriculum and teaching methods and so on. And video was just starting to be available for use in training and so on, and developed a lot of experiential training. My interest in family therapy continued, and most of the 10 years I was in Melbourne, I did some clinical work either in family or couples therapy. I was very helped by some early workshops I did with a lady called Margaret Topham, one of the early family therapists in Australia, and she and I then led a lot of workshops together over the years. So I always sort of kept some practice going whilst I was in that academic job. It didn't help my academic career, but it seemed to me that was what was, if you're teaching about practice, you needed to be involved in practice. I was then at a point where I faced a sort of more senior academic position. I was actually offered one, but turned it down because I really saw myself becoming more of a sort of a bureaucrat if I went that route, more and more management, administration, and practice and teaching what I loved. So I took up a position as the director of the Marriage Guidance Council of WA, now Relationships Australia WA. I was there for 6 years. That was a fairly difficult 6 years because it was the last of the State Marriage Guidance Council to rely almost entirely on volunteer counsellors. And the 6 years I was there, we moved into employing people with appropriate professional qualifications. And there was a lot of upheaval, to put it mildly. I also got very involved in lobbying about funding with Canberra and so on. End of 6 years, I decided I'd had enough of all that. So I went into private practice. I also, at the same time, started training as a psychotherapist in WA, mostly in the self-psychology / object relations tradition, the the group I trained with at that time. And I stayed in private practice for the rest of my career, except I had 8 years then at Edith Cowan University in a part-time lecturing position, half-time lecturing position. Edith Cowan has started the first tertiary course in counselling in WA. Those days a graduate diploma, while I was there, became a master's and added counselling and psychotherapy to the title. And again, that was a very rewarding time. I had some very good colleagues there, and with one of them wrote a couple of books and so on. It was all enjoyable, but reached a point where I felt I had done enough there and wanted to go back to private practice. I retired when about 15 years ago now. When I retired, I completed the circle. Along the way, I had studied for a graduate degree in theology, and I was ordained as an Anglican minister when I retired. And had 3 years in charge of a parish. Then I hit the church's compulsory retirement age, so I had to retire again.
A double retirement. Thank you, Jim. That was a rich journey through your development as a therapist, through family therapy, social work, psychiatric social work, marriage guidance, and then psychoanalytic psychotherapy, and then returning back to the theological pursuit. I guess you were initially disillusioned and disappointed with the quality of pastoral care, and by the time you came back to pastoral care, you were well and truly developed at the other end of the spectrum of what could be done.
Yes, I should add that for about 20 years, every second year, I taught a unit in pastoral care at a theological college in Perth. So I got my revenge.
You filled the gap that you found right back at the beginning in the UK, and so you were there right from the beginning of the coming together of a wide number, a large number of different counselling and psychotherapy associations in Australia. How did that begin? Like, what was your entry into that particular development?
Well, a colleague, Hugh Crago, was teaching at the University of New England, where they had a counselling course, and in 1996 he convened a meeting. I think there was a general sense counselling was taking off in Australia at that time. More and more training courses were starting in tertiary institutions. And there was I think an awareness, certainly what triggered Hugh Craig and his colleague Ruth Sturmey to call that first meeting was a concern that, in a sense, anyone could call themselves a counsellor. There was no sort of commonly accepted baseline in terms of training, no common code of ethics, etc., etc. And so Hugh and Ruth convened a meeting in Armidale. They invited 30 people from different training courses, mostly different training programs. I think it was, from memory, it was 3 days we spent there, really just to talk about what's happening with counsellor training, where are we going, what's the future, what are the challenges we face. And I and a colleague from Edith Cowan University, Jan Grant, went to that first meeting. I thought it would be a chance to catch up with some friends, and so no big deal sort of thing. But it actually turned out to be a quite fascinating meeting. I was looking back earlier at a paper I gave a year or two later, and in that paper I referred to how during that time at Armidale I found myself talking with someone over dinner from a totally different approach to counselling and therapy, someone I thought I would have nothing in common with, and discovered they'd read very widely in the areas I was interested in, and we had a lot of common ground. So it was that sort of a few days, but quite exciting. Hugh Crago acted as the facilitator for that. We then agreed at the end of those 3 days to meet again a year later but with a bigger group, and the 60 invitations were extended in 97. In the meantime, we set up a sort of steering committee. We called ourselves the Standing Committee of Educators and Trainers in Counselling and Psychotherapy, which is a bit of a mouthful, but we set up a sort of a committee to sort of take the matter forward and give ourselves one or two tasks to do during the ensuing year, one of which was to start working on definition of counselling and psychotherapy and how the two, where they had common ground, where they differed, and so on. I think that steering committee met several times between those two meetings, certainly a couple of times. One of those meetings, I left the room, meetings of the steering committee, I left the room briefly and had to get a coffee or something, and came back and was told that Ruth Sturmey, who was chairing the committee, had decided she didn't want to be chair anymore, and they'd all agreed I would be the chair. So that was not something I was anticipating, but had no choice about it really, thanks to the unanimous decision.
Congratulations, Jim Crawley. You're now the chair.
Yeah. The 97 meeting was again very, very lively, very exciting. I think from memory, Ron Perry acted as the facilitator for that meeting. Again, lots of small group discussion, lots of sharing of information and sort of getting to know each other and trying to identify what we saw as the key issues facing the profession. Code of ethics, training standards, could there be some sort of way of recognizing appropriately trained counsellors and so on. I think it was at that meeting that one of the metaphors used a lot was that of the umbrella. We did some sort of umbrella to bring all the different associations and training together. And we started thinking in terms of some sort of national body that would be an umbrella body, and I think we were very clear about not to replace the various associations, but to give them a sense of unity and to be a support to them and so on. The Standing Conference Committee continued to meet. My memories are hazy about how often the committee met, but it was certainly a number of times, and there were also at least one or two other sort of general meetings where delegates from all the associations came along for a weekend. So there were a lot of meetings during that 2-year period. Travelling from Perth to Melbourne or Sydney quite regularly. And interestingly, at that stage there was no money, so everybody had to pay their own way, which again from Perth wasn't cheap.
And a huge commitment.
Yes, and the amount. I've just been looking back, as I say, with some of the documents I've got on my computer, and the amount of work that we undertook was just extraordinary. Looking back on it, in a paper I gave at a conference in '99, after PACFA was formally established, when it was officially launched as a national conference, I used the metaphor. I hate flying, and the metaphor said PACFA has now taken off, and you made a number of references to the amount of flying that PACFA involved, how horrible that was. Anyway, we worked towards setting up this body. We chose the name PACFA. We were very clear it was a federation of associations. There was I don't think there's any real discussion at that time, any real thought about it being a member-based association. That would have been terribly threatening, especially some of the smaller, more specialist type of associations and training programs. So we're very clear it's to be an organisation of organisations, a federation. And we worked towards having something ready by the end of 1998. We set up a number of different working parties, each with a chair, and then they recruited members for their committee, their working party. One was looking at the register, forming a register. One was looking at developing a code of ethics. Another was looking at ways of developing liaison between all the associations. And a fourth one, I think, was looking at training standards. And those groups would do their work and report back to the board, the executive committee of the standing conference, or to a general meeting. the general meetings, again, I can't remember how many there were, but my recollection of them is they would usually be a couple of days. We would spend part of the time in just talking and getting to know each other in small groups. And I think, again, Ron Perry facilitated quite a lot of that. Then there'd be a business part of it where we'd have an agenda to get through and decisions to make and so on. And I remember that was because I was the chair of that business part. It was always pretty hectic because people had to leave by a certain time on Sunday to get their planes, and so we had a deadline, and getting through the agenda was often quite a challenge. That period leading up to PACFA, there was a lot of excitement, a lot of unity about it, but there was also a lot of tension, a lot of anxiety. Some of the meetings were, there was a lot, conflict's the wrong word, but a lot of very tense, keenly fought issues going on. And I remember after one of the board meetings waiting for a taxi with a colleague, and the colleague said to me, "How on earth do you cope with all that sort of tension and the fighting that goes on?" And I said, "Well, I've been a couples therapist for 20 years, it helps." But yeah, there was great motivation, but also a lot of anxiety that made it a challenging process.
How would you sum up what those key tensions were at that time? Where was that kind of passion around perceived differences?
I think it was probably at two levels. At one level, it was about things like standards and people wanting to sort of have their position, their tradition, their approach, the one that was accepted. So I remember particularly, for instance, with the register, I mean, there was some quite sort of vitriolic fights around that at times, what the sort of criteria should be and so on. I think at another level, there was particularly some of the people involved, some of the smaller, more specialist traditions and training programs. There was a concern about their identity being lost, that they'd somehow no longer in charge of their own ship, sort of thing. And yeah, so that sort of anxiety, I think. And we got to a point where we set a date for a meeting where we would be formally establishing PACFA and adopting a constitution. That was set for end of November in 1998 at St Hilda's College in University of Melbourne. And I think there were probably about 80 people turned up, representatives from different associations, 2 from each, and also a number of observers from other bodies, social work, the ASW, the College of Psychiatrists and so on, all sent along, we'd like them to send an observer if they wanted to. Prior to that, we produced a document sort of outlining how the proposal for PACFA came to be and the work that had been done and the point we got to and how we saw PACFA evolving. That's about a sort of a 10-page document, I think, that we produced. It was initially drafted by Ruth Sturmey after the first meeting, interestingly, I think. But then I sort of developed that and in the light of all that has happened since. And in September, prior to that meeting, I did a sort of a whiz around. I went to Adelaide, Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane. In each place, whoever was involved with PACFA convened a meeting of many practitioners as possible, where I could explain about PACFA and what was happening and so on. So that's all preparing the groundwork for the November meeting. And then we had the November meeting, and we, again from memory, I think the board, the standing committee, sort of met on the Saturday and sort of did sort of final planning and everything. And then on the Sunday, I think, was the formal meeting. I note in my notes as chairperson that I had to start the meeting by apologising because on the agenda I'd said that we would get the business out the way and then have time to discuss in groups and so on. But I was rolled by the committee yesterday. They said we should have the discussion first and then the business meeting. So, but that went through, and we ended up setting up a committee, and PACFA was in existence. There was a formal launch of PACFA at a national conference. I think it was in July '99. The journal that was then in existence, Psychotherapy in Australia, organised 2 or 3 conferences, and that was one of them. And they did a lot to support us along the way in the background, Liz Green and her colleagues. And we had I gave a paper at that conference describing what had happened, where we got to, and then we had a formal sort of event to officially sort of launch PACFA, as it were. I can't remember the details of that, who did it, but we did something. I stayed on for 4 years as president. At the end of that time, I felt I'd done enough. It was pretty exhausting. So I stepped down, and Ron Perry took over as president. I was the immediate past president on the committee. Again, I can't remember the details now, but I see from my notes that I was the convener for the conferences, national conferences PACFA organised in 2005, 2006, 2007. And then Ron stepped down as president, and I was free.
So that was your time. Thank you for sharing that history, Jim. I think it's very informative, and it does talk to the nature of our profession and the nature of our association that seeks to support the profession, and it talks to the diversity. Yeah, that we are a broad church. We are an umbrella of a range of different approaches to attempting to do the same thing, help people through their psychological and spiritual struggles. One of the things that occurred at around that time that your group was setting up PACFA was that another group was also being established for a similar purpose at the same time. What's your recollection?
Australian Counsellors Association, ACA, is that what you're referring to? Yeah.
Australian Counselling Association. Yeah. What was your experience of that?
Well,
or what did you...
I'm not quite sure when that came on the scene, but I suspect it was mid-90s sometime, and I'm pretty sure that was one of the triggers for calling the first meeting. ACA was sort of offering basically sort of correspondence courses in counselling, and it looks as if somebody could sort of do their course, call themselves a counsellor without having done any sort of face-to-face skill development work, that sort of thing. Now, that may be unfair to them. That was the impression that people were getting. And certainly during the early years, while I was the president, ACA was a sort of a bit of a shadow that loomed over us. I think they were very, very entrepreneurial, the way they went about things. They did a lot of advertising of their courses and so on. And I think in some ways there was a concern they were giving a sort of a slightly distorted perspective on what counselling and psychotherapy were about. I remember one incident. There was a small health fund in WA that someone drew my attention to the fact they'd just started saying that you could get benefits for counselling, providing the person you got counselling from was a member of the ACA. And I remember contacting the CEO of the fund and asking why, and he obviously had no understanding at all that of the nature of the affair. So why would you give benefit to somebody to say trained with the ACA and other people who've got graduate training, much longer, more detailed training and so on? He had no idea of the situation, and I think they then dropped the benefit fairly quickly. But there was that sort of constant, threat's too strong a word, but it was just a shadow that loomed over us with ACA, and to be honest, they weren't, I found as president, they weren't the easiest of people to deal with. Now that may have part been my fault, being I was too aggressive with them at times.
Were there efforts to engage at those early stages, and what did that look like from your perspective?
I think there were some attempts to engage in basically sort of phone calls, letters, that sort of thing. But yeah, the details are hazy now. Yeah.
And what did you see as, you talked about the perception that that they were sort of supporting correspondence courses in counselling, and I guess an easy pathway to counselling.
Yeah.
What was the difference from the PACFA perspective? What was this newly formed association? What was it trying to hold as the standard?
Well, we basically were saying that there's a certain minimum amount of training people must receive. There was the question of the content of that training, the syllabus, if you like, but also the skill training development part of it and the supervised practice part of it. There were all those sort of elements needed to be there. I think we were very aware of the broad spectrum of counselling and psychotherapy. On one side, we had people who had training that had taken them literally years to complete, with an enormous amount of their own personal therapy and all that sort of thing. The other end, people who've done much shorter courses, but we felt that there had to be enough sort of common ground in the training that we could say we were sort of under the same umbrella. And yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for sharing that, those reflections there, Jim. I think that I think you mentioned earlier that the minimum that PACFA really held out for was a tertiary qualification, and that was a key distinction. So you were president for 4 years. You were immediate past president for a couple of years and continued on while Ron Perry was president. Can you talk about some of your challenges and successes and maybe lost opportunities during your years on the PACFA board?
Yes, it's interesting. When I think back, most of my memories are the process leading up to November '98 and setting up of PACFA. My memories after are much more hazy. And I suspect that that's because once we set up PACFA in November '98, there was much more of a structure. There started to be some money. People had much more clearly defined roles. It now was an organisation that started to sort of live its own life, as it were. And yeah, so my own sort of memories of that time after '98 are much more hazy. I recall that I think it was after the '98 meeting, might have been just before, we had enough money that we felt we could employ someone to do some work for us. And we employed an admin officer, a lady called Sally Watson, young lady. I think we employed her 2 days a week or something. We found an agency in Melbourne lent us a sort of an upstairs room in the attic sort of thing. And we put Sally at a telephone in that room. She did a great job. She was very cheerful, flexible, willing, did a great job with a lot of the early paperwork and so on. And again, that was a transition, having to do it all ourselves, to starting to have an organisation that would function properly. It was after that I was president that we sort of moved to proper facilities in Drummond Street. I think that's where we went. And then Sally left and we employed someone, I suspect full-time or certainly more hours, and someone with more sort of qualifications than Sally had. But
do you have a recollection of why Melbourne was chosen? Because it was Drummond Street in Carlton, and the PACFA offices are still in Carlton. So why Melbourne?
I think in the days of the standing conference, it was a case of where is easiest for everybody to get to, or to pay our own fares, do it in our own time, etc. So we met mostly in Melbourne, but sometimes in Sydney, I think. I don't recall a meeting in Adelaide. We may have done. Certainly not Perth or Brisbane. And I think So I think it was partly sort of Melbourne seemed a bit more central for people, certainly from WA or whatever. I suspect it was also that there just tended to be some of the most active members of the Standing Conference were in Melbourne, and that's just sort of things gravitated towards that. Yeah, Priscilla Maxwell, who chaired the Register Working Party, Sophie Holmes, who chaired the Ethics Training Party. They certainly are both from Melbourne. And those are two very, very active working parties in the lead up to November '98.
Mm. So there's a number of people, and one of the things that I'm enjoying about these interviews is like hearing the names, hearing about the characters and the roles that they played in that journey. You referred there to Sophie Holmes, you've referred to Ron Perry. Who else is sort of stands out in your memory as pivotal to the development of PACFA those early years? You talked about Ruth Sturmey, you talked about Hugh Crago, and your colleague from Edith Cowan. I think that was Dr. Jane Grant. Is that correct?
Jane Grant.
Yeah. And sorry, say it again.
Dr. Jane Grant. Yeah.
Dr. Jane Grant. And so anybody else that was sort of present in that time, and what's your memory of their contribution and the achievements that together you were able to make?
Yes. I can't remember everybody, and that's so naming a few names is unfortunate. But and Priscilla Maxwell, I mentioned, she did an enormous amount of work for the Register. She fought her corner for the Register very firmly. It was quite a tiger about standards and so on. But she made an enormous contribution. There's a lady called Margaret Berkovic from Sydney, who I think was a psychotherapist. Lionel Davies, I think he was the first treasurer, possibly. I don't know. David Axton from Queensland, he taught at the Queensland University of Technology. He was very involved right through. And a psychoanalyst from Sydney, Maria Teresa Hook, was again made an enormous contribution, not in specific role as such as I recall, but a thoughtful, creative presence in the discussion, speaking from a lot of experience. Yeah. So it was a very rich group, that sort of group that set up the original PACFA. Enormous amount of experience in the group.
And you somehow managed to organise annual conferences for a number of years.
Yes, I don't know when the first one was. I just got in my notes that I was the convener of the conference in 2005, 2006, 2007. I can vaguely remember them. I remember one of them. We had a keynote speaker. Oh dear, I'm forgetting his name. He died not that long ago. He was a psychoanalyst from Sydney, written a lot of books on narcissism and so on. Lovely guy. He was, I think, by then retired, but he turned up to give his keynote address, and there'd been a miscommunication. And we told him he had an hour, and we'd actually allowed, I think, 25 minutes or something. But he was very gracious about it, so got through it. Yeah, but the details of the conference escaped me. Yeah.
Any other significant achievements or challenges, or particular challenges or lost opportunities that you experienced as in those early years, and that PACFA experienced?
Yes, one thing I'll come back to. One other name I realised I haven't mentioned, which is very important, and that was Dr. Margot Schofield, who played an enormous role in the early days. She was head of the counselling course at University of New England, and then moved to La Trobe University to a chair, I think, there. Again, she did a lot of work in the background in terms of providing sort of academic solidity to what we were doing, helping us to make sure we thought things through adequately and so on, and also in starting to look at some of the research around counselling and psychotherapy, and starting to make some of that a bit more available, educating those of us who weren't researchers about that. The main lost opportunity, I think, and it started, I guess, towards the end of the time when I was president. But that was the movement of the psychoanalytic and psychoanalytic psychotherapy traditions away from PACFA. They were absolutely central in the early days and made an enormous contribution. But for all sorts of reasons, I think, once PACFA was established, they started to have second thoughts. And I don't know the details now of how it came about or what happened, but they parted company with PACFA.
You don't have a sense of what it was that they felt wasn't going to serve them and their interests?
No, I don't, unfortunately.
There is always a tension between counselling and psychotherapy and what it means. And you said earlier that there were a lot of conversations right from the very first meeting around counselling and psychotherapy, and that the standing committee actually did quite a lot of work trying to define and differentiate between them as distinct professions.
Yeah.
What can you share?
I don't know what the sort of specific issues were that led to that parting of the ways, but I was a member of the Psychotherapy Association in WA, and small body, 15 members probably at that time. I think I was seen as a bit of a sort of an oddity for being so involved in PACFA. Although one or two other members, Paul McAvoy, a colleague in particular, were again very actively involved in the early days of PACFA. But I think there was a sense that PACFA somehow risked sort of watering down what psychotherapy was. One of the key issues in that analytic tradition is the personal therapy of the therapist. And when I train, and I guess it's still the same, but the training not only involved the theory and the supervision, but 3 years, twice weekly therapy as a minimum. And there was a sense that going under an umbrella with people who may not have much or any personal therapy, but were still calling themselves a counsellor and claiming to be able to help the same people was, people got uneasy about that in some way. So there was that, there's a certain elitism about that. But, I guess it's very natural that if you put in a lot of effort into your own training and all the rest of it, you want to protect that turf.
Yeah, it's important that additional work, that additional training, that additional personal work is acknowledged and valued, and we continue to work to figure out how we can make sure that distinction is credible and is maintained and has benefits for consumers in particular, and can be, it's important that if there are psychotherapists and there are counsellors, then those differences can be utilised in a meaningful way. So the next question I have is around your observations. You said you took a back seat. I think you spent more time with the Association for Psychoanalytic Psychotherapy of Western Australia, and that's been continued to be a focus of yours since. It sort of took a step back from PACFA. But if you could share from a distance what your sense is around how PACFA has evolved since you were pivotal in setting it up.
PACFA is an organisation I can't really say much about. I looked at the PACFA website recently and thought, wow, this baby has grown up. The number of people employed and the complexity of it and so on, which is great. And when I became immediate past president on the board, I deliberately tried to take a back seat. I guess that's why I organised conferences rather than anything else. I didn't want to sort of be the a voice sort of saying how it really would have been done, should have been done if was still in the chair. That's just a pain. And around the same time, I also stopped working at Edith Cowan University, went back into full-time private practice. So, you know, in a sense, I didn't have much or direct involvement with PACFA. I guess the things that have encouraged me, I see references from time to time, the sort of membership of PACFA being a sort of requirement for a position or something like that. I still, to my surprise, do a lot of teaching on the course at ECU as a sessional lecturer. I teach last 3 years I've taught a unit. And again, seeing the way in which sort of PACFA and PACFA standards come into the sort of the structure, the ethos of the course is encouraging, because it's a sort of it's really what we intended from the beginning, that PACFA would be the sort of standard setter and boundary for counselling and psychotherapy. I don't know how it came about that PACFA became a member-based organisation. It's sort of, I just heard it one day on a surprise, but my reaction was a positive one. I thought, good, that's a big step forward. It would have been utterly impossible in '98 to have a member-based organisation. It would have been a death blow to what we're trying to do. The insecurities and competitiveness and so on would have been that was an absolute no-go. So I was very encouraged to see that after sort of, when it happened, 15, 20 years, whatever, that PACFA reached a point where that was possible. I think, sort of a national body always has more clout than an independent state body. So that's good.
And then a comment then on the professions more generally. What have you seen sort of where PACFA's been showing up? What's your sense of how the professions of counselling and psychotherapy have developed in Australia since the 90s?
Again, I'm not sure I have much of an informed nature to say about that. I retired 15 years ago, and some of my colleagues dribbled into retirement, keeping a small caseload going. I didn't. I retired. That was it. My sense is that there's a good vitality. I mean, the association I belong to, APWA in WA, the Association of Psychotherapy of WA, small body. 10, 12 years ago, we were saying, will we survive? That's all, because the training is long and expensive, and is this the last training group we're going to put through? What's going to be our future? Was the sort of way we were thinking at times. But they're flourishing. Their membership's doubled. It looks like from the outside. I don't have any contact, but from the outside, it looks like quite a thriving and viable group with quite a useful size of number of trainees going through and so on. So I think overall, I think there is a sort of a vitality about the profession. I think one of the things that we have to be careful about is that we talk in a way that the community, general community, and the government bodies and departments and so on can understand, and don't make ourselves look too sort of esoteric or alternative, which is sometimes a bit of a danger. But I think if we can do that, then I think over time there'll be more and more recognition of counselling psychotherapy, and things like Medicare or health fund benefits and so on will become much more. We'll be included in that much more. Yeah.
Thanks, Jim. What would you say is your vision for the future of counselling and psychotherapy? I guess specifically in Australia, but more generally, what would you like to see?
I would like to see much, much, much more research being done, both about process and outcomes. When I grew up first trained in England, when psychoanalysts versus the behavioral psychologists were at war. And, people like Hans Eysenck were sort of saying there's no evidence that psychoanalysis works, but there is what we do. Some forms of helping are much easier to investigate. If you only have a limited number of sessions and very specific techniques and goals, you can measure that much more easily. A lot of counselling and psychotherapy is much more diffuse than that. It's much more sort of open-ended. Takes time and so on, and that makes it much more difficult often to do the research, I think. But we do need that research done if we're going to convince people that what we do is effective. I remember once when I was at Marriage Guidance Council, the funding used to come from the Attorney General's Department in Canberra in those days. And, you sort of got your chunk of money each year, and that was it, and certain criteria you meant to meet. One of the criteria was that the average number of sessions per case shouldn't be more than, I think it was 4 or 5 or something. And I got sort of stuck into that. I remember having arguments with the people in Canberra who weren't psychologists. So look, after 4 or 5 sessions, a good counsellor will be just starting to do some work with a couple. Saying that you're only going to fund for 4 or 5 sessions is just crazy. But we need the research to back up those sorts of arguments. Remember another time I was supervising a therapist who was doing some very good work with someone who'd been, I think it was a sexual abuse case, something like that. And they were really starting to help the person. They said, and they came in and said, I've only got 2 more sessions. They work for a government agency. I said, what else do you mean? I'm not allowed to see people more than 10 times. I'll just have my 8th session. But that is just crazy. This person, the first time, is really starting to open up, to face some issues, be prepared to explore them and so on. But again, we need the evidence to be able to say that this is what's needed if it's going to work.
Yeah, and understanding that value of forming a trusting relationship and accepting at that political and economic level that so much of the work of therapy is the client's first experience of a relationship in which they feel safe, in which they can begin to explore what it means to be themselves without having to have their defences up in a protective way.
Yeah. I remember once having a client referred to me, a private practice. I did a usual sort of intake interview, got the history and so on. And this person had a nightmarish background of childhood abuse and all sorts of things. It was really horrific. And they've been suffering some chronic depression and whatever for quite a long time. Been seeing a psychiatrist for quite a long time, given lots of medication. And I said, obviously what you said makes a lot of sense of what your background, makes a lot of sense of what you're struggling with, and we can do some work around that. What does your psychiatrist, Dr. So-and-so, say about that? I said, what do you mean? I said, well, what's he had to say about the impact of your childhood and the abuse and so on you? Oh, I've never told him, he's never asked me. And it was sort of like, where do you begin?
The chalk and cheese of the different approaches, and really talks to what it is that psychotherapy and counselling has to offer people, a genuine interest in who they are, where they've come from, and who they might become if they develop the capacities to make those kinds of choices. When I spoke to you earlier, you mentioned that you'd like to see psychotherapy and counselling be a part of mainstream health and mental health service provision, that there's a sense that even though there's been a lot of growth in training, a lot of growth in the number of counsellors and psychotherapists that are being registered with different associations, that we're probably still not welcomed and properly represented within that mainstream service provision.
Yes, I mean, I think it'll partly be a matter of time, but it's also about saying, doing the lobbying backed up by good evidence and good arguments. It just takes time, I think. And I think we also, as a profession, we need to monitor our public image, make sure, say, we're seen as being responsible and mainstream and so on. Some counsellors, some psychotherapists sometimes talk as if they sort of live on a different planet, and that doesn't help. So we need to be aware that if we're going to be accepted, we've got to engage with the bodies we want to accept us.
Yeah, thanks. A combination of research, advocacy, which I'm aware, both research and advocacy, and even public perception. That's about communications and marketing and promotion and stakeholder engagement, and it's all of that is resource intensity. So there's always this challenge of having the resources that you need to develop as a profession, and quite differently resourced to the way that bodies of knowledge like psychology and psychiatry have been resourced over the years.
I think the general public has a very uninformed understanding of what counselling involves. Often it's a sort of general term that can mean almost anything. And once many years ago, I was driving around the car, and days when Parliament was broadcast on the radio, and I was listening to it was question time from the Senate or something, and the then Attorney General was being challenged about, Gareth Evans, being challenged about a mistake something has happened, and he sort of said, "Oh yeah, the public servant in question has been counselled about this." I imagine the interaction was the absolute antithesis of counselling. Standing in front of the desk and being bellowed at, probably. But I think that the word is used so loosely, so often, and there's a need for constant sort of taking opportunities to inform people what's involved, both what counsellors are trained to do, what their training involves, and the sorts of help that it can provide to people.
Yeah, and language is just aware of how significant language is, both the language of counselling and counsellor, and the language of psychotherapy and psychotherapist, and how that language is used contextually, and to what extent can we as a profession influence, and that's a big part of the original challenge for which was set up, and the ongoing challenge that we continue to try and work towards. So some final comments then on what you see as the emerging challenges, the future challenges facing the professions, and possibly even the opportunities facing the professions into the future.
I don't think I've got any specific observations. In the last few years, the greater focus on mental health, and some of it informed, some of it not very informed, but that sort of emphasis on mental health creates, I think, a good opportunity for the counselling psychotherapy profession. Again, we have to get in there and say, look, we've got something very important to offer, which, it's not an alternative to what other professions have to offer, like psychiatry or clinical psychology and so on, but it's an important part of the overall suite of services that can be available.
And I think you said earlier that the what you think is important there is for that to be like use the umbrella of an organisation like PACFA to present a kind of a unified front on behalf of this collective that we call counsellors and psychotherapists, rather than taking too much of a piecemeal approach, which was what would have happened if all of those independent associations across the country hadn't found a way of becoming effective. The opportunities, so I think that's part of the opportunities. I think earlier you also mentioned the importance of credibility and how the robust criteria, the robust standards, and the robust requirements around training in order to have people ready for registration, that you also saw that as pretty key going forwards.
And again, yeah, you ask for encouraging signs. Okay, here's one. The last 3 years, I've taught a unit on the master's program at the UCAL. The unit I teach is an experiential unit, a series of weekend workshops, getting students to look at their own life experience and how that shapes the way they perceive, react to clients, understanding more about what transference, countertransference means in reality and so on. And I've been very encouraged by the group of 25 students in the class, probably about sort of between 15 and 20 of them make reference to their own therapy. That didn't happen 10 years ago, nothing like that extent. So again, I think Zopactra is probably helping people to realise that what it means to be a professional in that area, that it's the academic training, the experience supervision, but also the work on self that is so important. Whatever sort of how you describe your practice as counselling or a psychotherapist, it's the person of the counsellor, of the therapist, which is the main instrument. Yeah.
And we talked earlier about how that individuality, it's one of the things that does set counselling apart from other ways of providing mental health or other psychological services, is that we really accept and embrace the idea that each counsellor is unique. Each counsellor is trained to, what we want as counsellors to be trained to a sufficient level for them to be seen by the public and stakeholders like government and employers as we want them all to be perceived as safe, robust, credible. And at the same time, each of them is going to be unique in the way that they practice, and that it will remain almost impossible to say this is what a counsellor is going to do in the session with you, because the individual counsellor will meet the individual client, and that will be a unique dyad, and that unique dyad will co-create something that is unique and won't be replicable across similar dyads. Okay, Jim, anything final that you'd like to share?
No, that feels like we've covered quite a lot of ground.
Okay, lovely. Well, it's been wonderful speaking with you. I really appreciate your time and your contribution today, and also to PACFA and the profession over the years, dating back 20 years now. So I guess thank you, and
thank you.
Take care.
Thanks. It's been interesting to do it.
Okay, thanks, Jim.
Thanks.